Now it's my privilege to introduce our featured speaker, Dr. Veronique de Rugy. Dr. de Rugy is the George Gibbs Chair in Political Economy and a Senior Research Fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Mason University. She's also a nationally syndicated columnist whose work explores the policies that shape long-term economic growth. Her writing is widely read for its rigor and willingness to tackle difficult fiscal realities head-on. She's a weekly columnist for Creator Syndicate, a regular contributor to Reason magazine, and a frequent commentator across major media outlets, including Bloomberg Television, The Wall Street Journal, The Washington Post, CNN, and C-SPAN. In recognition of her influence, Political Magazine named her among the 50 thinkers, doers, and visionaries transforming American politics. Dr. de Rugy has testified before Congress multiple times on fiscal policy, debt, deficits, and regulation. Before joining Mercatus, she held research roles at the American Enterprise Institute, the Cato Institute, and the Atlas Economic Research Foundation. She earned her PhD in economics from the Parthenon-Sorbonne in Paris. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Veronique de Rugy.
Well, it's an honor to be here. I came here yesterday, like most first-time speakers, not having read all my emails, not really knowing where I was going, not really knowing what that group really was about. And now I have a feeling I've made friends for life, that I am in a place that actually does incredibly serious research that I will use. And I am unbelievably captivated by your energy and your willingness to be there on a, Tuesday morning to listen and to be scared to death about the fiscal situation of this country. It's crazy. And I thought there was nothing moving in California. I'm just like, so like the president of the university, I'm actually really optimistic. Like I'm always optimistic because this is the best country in the world. Just heads down. I come from France, lots of great stuff, but there's nothing that compares America. This is also an incredibly exciting moment we live in. There's no timing here, by the way. I'm just saying this because I could talk for 3 hours. Just be warned. Just be warned. So it's also an incredibly exciting moment, right? AI, medical innovation, 3D manufacturing, there's all of this promising to change our lives in many great ways on net. But I really want to talk to you today about something that could actually squander that promise, and that's the unsustainable fiscal path that we find ourselves in. So let's start. The Congressional Budget Office, which is the office that actually responds to Congress and gives an update about the fiscal situation of the country, just released its 10-year projection. Like with forecasts, there's always, reason to actually take it for a grain of salt. Nonetheless, it tells you something. So in the next 10 years, just to give you an idea, our debt right now our public debt is 32, at the end of the year, it's going to be $32 trillion. So 32 with 12 zeros, right? In the next 10 years, we're going to accumulate another 25 trillion in deficits. Think about this, just a little. In the entire history of this country, we've accumulated $32 trillion in public debt. And now, in the next 10 years, we're going to accumulate a cumulative deficit of $25 trillion. It's crazy. Our debt stands at 101% of GDP. In a few years, it's going to be as high as it was at the peak of the Second World War, where we were actually fighting a world war. We're actually at peace, mostly. Let me say that again. We're mostly at peace. We're growing. The market is crazy now. The economy is not the market, and the market is not the economy. But nonetheless, right? I mean, and yet we have, our debt stands at 101% of GDP. At the end of the decades, there will be at least 120% of GDP. And in 30 years, it will be 172% of GDP. It's insane. So some will say that, well, the reason is simple. We have a tax problem. We don't have a revenue problem. We don't, actually. When you look at the projection, going back and going forward, and where we stand now in terms of revenue as a share of GDP, it's actually above the 50-year average. And there's a kind of an important point that is worth pointing out that no one actually wants to hear, and that is that under the current tax system, actually it's extremely hard to raise more revenue without creating enormous damage. So actually, tax solution wouldn't be the first place I would go to. Not to mention that, again, we don't have a tax problem. We have a spending problem. The explosion of programs like Social Security and Medicare can't be overstated. I mean, they are not just the driver of our past debt, but they are the driver of our future debt. One of the things that CBO shows is that first, if you take what we call mandatory programs, basically the programs that are somewhat on autopilot, and that's Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and interest on the debt. I mean, they represent roughly 70% of the budget, right? Listen to this. According to CBO, Social Security, Medicare, and interest on the debt, in 10 years will consume 100% of revenue. 100% of revenue within 10 years. It could be actually like within fewer than 10 years. These are the drivers of our future debt. These are the driver of our current debt. But we have an even bigger looming problem. And that problem is interest on the debt. I've mentioned it. It used to be, before COVID, roughly $250 billion every year of interest payment on our debt. Now it stands at $1 trillion. At the end of the decades, we're going to pay $2 trillion in interest payment on the debt. $2 trillion, it's enormous. Do you remember that $25 trillion I told you about the cumulative deficit? 16 trillion of that is interest payment on the debt. And in 30 years, interest payment on the debt will consume 50% of our revenue. That's the end of the numbers program. Like I may mention a few $116 trillion down the road, but for now, rest in peace. So, it's not good. We are, and the CBO says it over and over again, we are on an unsustainable path. We are. You'll say, come on. People like you have been saying this for literally 25 years. Maybe not 25 years, but for a long time. Other peoples have been actually talking about the sky falling for even more than this, right? There were people saying this before I even moved to the US, that we're on an unsustainable path. So it seems to me that economists who are warning about a debt crisis are kind of like the guy for the last 50 years or 30 years predicting rain, right? And act like a broken clock. It may happen eventually. That's not as good a forecast as what Dan can do, since we know he's like the best in the world, right? Come on, yeah. So it's a fair challenge. It's a fair challenge, but I have two responses to this. Actually, I don't think it is quite correct. The first one is kind of a defense of people like me who have been warning about the unsustainable path that our country has been on for so long. The case we've been making for all of that time has never been that the country like the United States, who is a powerhouse, couldn't borrow more money at a given moment. But the thing is that we've always known that going forward, there were all of these programs which spending was exploding and were unfunded. It was obvious. We knew it. There were trustees' report coming out and saying it every year. And so the warning about borrowing more money today when you're going to have such an enormous unfunded problem on your hands in the future doesn't seem quite wise. That was the case. That was the warning about the debt. So it was never about like, you can't, I mean, in my case, I will admit, part of it is like, I like my government super small so I could put it in my back pocket. So I would kind of like say, I don't want more debt, I don't want more debt because I want a smaller government. But it wasn't just that. The other thing is that to people who say, okay, look, you guys have been saying that we have a debt problem for a long time, and debt has gone up, debt to GDP is now at 100% of GDP, and we haven't had a debt crisis. I say, what are you talking about? What are you talking about? We've just had the highest inflation in 40 years. 40 years. Why did that inflation emerge? We've spent money like drunken sailors without any fiscal backing. There's a moment where inevitably, when you flood the economy with nominal debt and with no future policy that can credibly support it, inevitably you get inflation. The thing about modern economy is that inflation is a form of debt crisis. In fact, very likely, our next big debt crisis is going to look more like this one on steroid than actually the kind of straight out default that everyone fears. Now, inflation is a form of default, right? But let's also think about, you may not believe this, but look at the signs. There are many other signs of people who only think that debt crisis takes the form of default or traders screaming on the trading floors. Look at interest rates. You may not be aware, but before the pandemic, most of what I was spending my time doing is actually fighting the academics who were saying that we should never worry about the debt because it has no cost, because interest rates will always and always and always stay low because the demand for American US debt is unsatiable, right? There was this eternal flame. I remember reading articles using that, that song, The Eternal Flame, and making the case that this was US debt. There will always be demand, and interest rates were going to stay low, and as long as interest rates stayed lower than growth, we had nothing to worry about, right? Interest rates are much higher. These guys really truly believe that interest rates could never go up that much. Interest rates are really high compared to these blessed time where interest rates were extremely low. The bad news is I can tell you from studying the period where the last time we had high inflation is that even though inflation is lowered quite dramatically compared to its peak, interest rates are unlikely to go back down anytime soon. And in fact, if we continue fueling the economy with so much debt, I doubt we are going to see interest rates going back down significantly lower for a long time, unless, of course, there's some crazy innovation and the AI promise come true and somehow we have like 10% economic growth or something like this. I have to caveat always what I say just in case, I'm on the record and someone said, you said this would never happen. So anyway, what about weak auctions? We've had weak auctions, literally the inability to sell all of our long-term debt, which has put Treasury in a position to have to kind of change tactics and start selling shorter debt. That's an issue. That's a real issue. Do you understand? Like, we roll over 11 trillion of debt every year. The maturity of our debt is short. 30% of our debt has a maturity of less than a year. 18% of our debt has a maturity of less than 3 months. So we're actually highly susceptible to any change in interest rates. It's a big deal. Weak auctions in the US, it would have been inconceivable a few years ago, and yet we've had that, right? And so there are signs. There are signs. We just went through a debt crisis. A debt crisis doesn't always look like Argentina or Greece, sometimes it just looks like all of a sudden your grocery prices is up by 30%. We just had a debt crisis. And so to all of those who say, well, the debt is high, but we haven't had a debt crisis, I say, no, we just had a debt crisis. And get ready for more if we continue down this path. Because we're going to continue down this path. Okay, so you may say, well, the economy is growing and unemployment is low, right? Inflation is back down. What's the big deal? Here's the problem with the debt. The debt has actually a very quiet and slow, creates quiet and slow damage onto our economy. And the problem with the slow and quiet damage onto our economy is precisely that it doesn't actually create the urgency that you need to create a change. Now, I will admit to you, by the way, that when inflation started rising, I thought inflation was going to do all the talking, and that they would actually kind of shake Congress back in its right mind. I was wrong. I was just so wrong. And then we were going to get, the kind of fiscal adjustment that we need. So we know from the literature that when the government flood the credit market with lots of demand for credit, right? It competes with everyone. It competes with the business who wants to expand. It competes with the entrepreneur who wants to launch. It competes with the young couple who wants to buy a house. It competes with the manufacturing who wants to buy new material to expand to. And that pushed interest rates up. And that is actually confirmed by the literature. Like the connection between higher debt and higher interest payment, higher interest rate, which affects the entire private sector, is insidious, but it's real. And that is something that, for instance, the CBO takes under consideration that burden of the debt on interest rates, but it has an estimate that is significantly lower than what actually the most conservative literature actually shows. So there's a case to be made that the CBO really underestimate the burden of the debt on interest payment. But the most important part, in my opinion, is like that also triggers slower growth. And I know that you've had in the last few years speakers who talk to you about the importance of growth, so I won't go back into how important it is, but man, it is so important. Growth is so incredibly important. Debt, we have over 70 studies. We know that debt slows growth. You must know that we just can't overestimate the impact of growth on the ability of people to become wealthier, on income mobility, on the ability of innovating more, on the ability of, especially for lower income people, of making it up in the world. So debt, through its impact on growth, makes us poorer in a very significant way. Except, as I said, it's slow and quiet, and you don't see it as much as we would need to see it to see change. But there's another thing, is like debt makes us meaner. And that's one of the things that economists tend to not think about and not talk about very much. Here's the thing. Growth is not just sublime, it's actually ethical. Growth is not just important for sustained GDP. It is essential for the kind of society we want to be. When there's a lot of growth in the economy, we are more tolerant. We're more accepting of newcomers. We are more trusting. We are more willing to take risks. We see the pie expanding, so anyone who comes in who's different doesn't feel like a threat. We believe that young people believe that they can make it and have a better life than their parents. But when growth slows, what happens is that our mindset shifts. we go to a zero-sum thinking. Now, all of a sudden, immigrants become the other and become a threat. Trade doesn't become mutually beneficial. It becomes predatory. We start scapegoating different groups. There's an enormous growth, there's an enormous tax, intolerance tax that happen. And by the way, the empirical studies show that the impact of slow growth on peace, tolerance, and all the things that we value in a liberal society happen just when the economy slows. Not simply in the economy where, even so, it happens even in rich economies. So I actually think that a lot of what we're going through, the rise of populism on the right and on the left, is a product of an economy that hasn't performed as well as it should have, and that had people shifting to a mindset where we trust each other much less. And that is a big deal. Now, and so debt does this through its impact on growth. Finally, I'll say that debt is remarkably unfair to future generations. Remarkably unfair. No matter what you think the debt crisis will look like, whether it's going to be a repricing of the debt and the sudden rise of inflation, which I think could happen as soon as Congress decides to borrow all the money that is going to be needed to maintain benefits on Social Security and Medicare, as opposed to do the responsible thing, which is to reform these programs. That could happen in like between 6 and 10 years. Inflation could emerge. Or if you think that actually is going to happen down the road, one thing is sure, future generation will be left holding the bag. Higher taxes, today's debt is higher taxes. Higher taxes means slower economy, higher unemployment, all the problems that we just talked about. Future generations that are already, for these programs, the younger people, they're going to be the one left with paying for the dinner that we're enjoying now and don't want to do anything about. So I have 30 seconds, so what do we do? The first, I could go on for like 25 hours. You know, I think about this when Ted Cruz was doing his all-nighter, I was like, I got this. So what do we do? Well, we know how to reduce our debt to GDP ratio. We know how to. The literature is very clear. You pass fiscal adjustments that are mostly based on spending cuts. And especially reform is in social programs, that is entitlement in the American context. We know this from looking at, a case of fiscal adjustment everywhere. We need to reform entitlement spending. Social Security, Medicare are I'm going to take 30 seconds just to say one thing that people need to hear. Seniors are overrepresented in the top income quintile. Seniors are overrepresented in the top income quintile. It doesn't mean that every senior is rich, but seniors are overrepresented in the top income quintile, which means that these two programs are fundamentally unfair. They are a transfer of wealth from the relatively young and poor to the relatively old and wealthy. This needs to change. This is why I am profoundly against reforming these programs through taxes that will fall yet again on younger generation. We need to cut spending on those who can afford it the most. That's what we need to do. This is reforming these two programs is the way where you do successful reduction of debt to GDP ratio. This is the way you put us back on track. This is the way where you restore trust, tolerance, and peace for this country. And this is the way we fulfill the American dream. Thank you.